Obvious that we had a very successful wine tasting last night, so I'm sure that the seats will be taken in as we progress along this morning, and we want to go ahead and get started with our solid waste management seminar. One of the major environmental debates in Congress this year will concern solid waste legislation. Dr. J. Winston Porter is one of the nation's leading experts on solid and hazardous waste management, and was Assistant Administrator for Solid Waste and Emergency Response from 1985 to 1989 for the Environmental Protection Agency. While at EPA, Dr. Porter re-energized the federal solid waste program, including the setting of a national goal of recycling 25% of all municipal solid waste by 1992. Under his direction, the Superfund Waste Site Cleanup Program reached a level of activity with cleanup work now underway at over 800 sites. In this seminar, Dr. Porter will outline the major issues Congress will deal with and their implications for the food service industry. Join me in welcoming Dr. J. Winston Porter. Doctor?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm from Texas originally myself. I grew up in Baytown and went to school at the University of Texas. Then I disappeared about 25 years ago and come back periodically, but I really enjoy coming down here. As was indicated, I had the job in the last half of the 80s in the federal government, which dealt with Superfund and RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Act, hazardous waste, medical waste, needles washing up on the Jersey shores, and all kinds of good stuff. It was a real tough job. I had a lot of fun with people in Congress, got called a lot of names and all that. In fact, I didn't think it was all that tough, but when I left, my wife suggested we spend a couple of weeks in Beirut unwinding. So, but anyway, we didn't do that. We decided not to go to Beirut and unwind, so we stuck out around here. But what I want to do today is talk to you about solid waste a little bit, and particularly narrow it down to your industry. I've done a lot of work for McDonald's Corporation, which some of you may have heard of, and so that's given me a real exposure the last few years of the kind of issues McDonald's and other quick service food companies have faced. But I've kind of been drifting a little bit into this business as far as the food business, and I want to give you some of my perspectives on what I think is going to happen. There's been a new law passed just very recently in the state of Texas on solid waste recycling, so it's fortuitous today that we can also talk a little bit about that. I wanted to kind of start with giving you the kind of the big picture on municipal solid waste, or garbage if you prefer. It was really about my most urgent issue at EPA. Urgent not in the sense that it's, in my judgment, a terrible environmental problem, in the sense that some other things might be, but urgent in the sense that it just keeps on coming and you've got to deal with it. There's no way you can finesse garbage. All of you who put things in your dumpsters know that, and those of you who are with cities know that. New York City has 27,000 tons a day of garbage, for example, and it just comes day after day after day, and it has to be dealt with, and we're running out of space to deal with it. So what I want to do is I want to first talk to you about the kind of national scene, give you a little bit of historical perspective. Congress is dealing with this issue right now, so again, it's fairly timely. First off, in the late 1980s, when I was still at EPA, the world kind of began to get involved with garbage again at the national level. The states and localities, of course, never got out of the business, but we at the federal level and the Congress particularly got very involved in the early 80s with Superfund and Love Canal and those kind of things, nuclear waste, medical waste, all kinds of contentious issues, and the garbage thing was a little bit put on the back burner. But that began to, I guess the thing that really brought it back into our focus, most of you will remember the famous garbage barge of a few years ago. When that garbage barge left New York City and couldn't find a place to land, began to sort of come up and down the East Coast, the world kind of rediscovered garbage. And we had a lot of, Congress loves things like that, so we had a lot of congressional hearings and a lot of TV shows and other things to say, you know, what are we going to do with this big crisis about garbage? Well, frankly, New York State exports about 800 equivalent things to that barge every day. So it isn't like there's no garbage exported from New York State. It's just that was the first one that was in a barge, and so it got very visible. So what I began to do is think about where we were heading in this business and what I could do, if anything, to kind of sharpen the focus. And one of the things I did in a speech in New York City in 1988, I stood up and announced a national goal of trying to recycle 25% of all of our solid waste by 1992. I did that for a couple of reasons. One is I thought recycling would be very helpful given our other options. And number two, I was very concerned about some really crazy goals which are being set by other people. Barry Commoner, for example, the big environmentalist in New York, was talking about 80 and 90% recycling for New York City and other places, which is, if not impossible, a little crazy in my opinion, and I'll explain more about that later. So I wanted to get the focus on recycling, and I wanted to get the focus in a range that I thought was at least doable. In those days, what I said about the 25% goal is that it was tough but doable. I think I'd probably amend that a little bit and say it's very tough but doable. And since Texas has now set a 40% goal, we'll see how that goes. This led to something EPA called the Agenda for Action, which is a new sort of manifesto on solid waste that talked about something called an integrated approach. What that simply means is in solid waste, we're going to have to use all our tools. We're going to have to try to reduce our garbage somewhat at the source. We're going to have to recycle. We're going to have some incinerators around the country, not everywhere. And we're going to have some landfills. And we're going to have some composting. And so you'll hear people talk a lot about either or. Are you for incineration? Or are you for recycling? Are you for composting? My judgment is that in many jurisdictions, we're going to need some combination of all those things. And they all have their place. They don't all fit in one place, but they all have their place. And they can all be made safe. I think that's the important thing. I'm not prepared personally to write off any of those. Incineration, for example, is fairly unpopular in some locales, but we can build very good, safe plants to generate electrical energy using solid waste. And in my judgment, we should do that where the economics and other things indicate that. Let me take you real quickly through some of the commodities in solid waste and tell you what I think the answers are likely to be on each commodity and kind of where we are, because you deal with basically all of these in your operations. 40% of the solid waste stream in this country is paper, of one form or the other. The two biggest components of that are newsprint and corrugated cardboard. They're about equal. Pretty well recycled already. The American Paper Institute has set a national goal of their own of trying to recycle 40% of all paper in the country by 1995. And they're at about 25 or 30% already. Over half the corrugated is already recycled in the country, about 30% of the newsprint's recycled, etc. Glass is recycled at a somewhat lower rate, but probably about 20% of the glass bottles are recycled in the country. Glass is a pretty good thing to recycle if you can get your hands on it. It doesn't burn in incinerators. On the other hand, it's fairly benign in landfills, so it's got a number of options. Plastics. You've all heard this story. You've all heard about polystyrene foam and the big debate McDonald's and others have had over that. I guess my feeling about plastics is there's probably too much emphasis on recycling. I'm all for recycling, and I think it makes a lot of sense to recycle certain kinds of plastics. The problem plastics have, frankly, are two or three. One, there's a lot of them. There's polyethylene terephthalate, the PET pop bottles. There's the so-called styrofoam or polystyrene foam cups. There's a polyethylene bag you get when you check out of the supermarket. And there's about 15 different kinds of plastics we use routinely. And secondly, on a more positive note, plastics, in my judgment, are a good candidate for both landfilling and for incineration. In waste-to-energy plants, plastics burn very clean, and they have about twice the heat value as coal. So if we're going to use coal and fuel oil to generate power in this country, I don't see why we can't use some plastic, which in fact burns cleaner than either fuel oil or coal, to generate some power. So plastic is only about 1 or 2% recycled at this point. The big plastic companies, the Dow Chemicals, the DuPonts, the Carbides, are really into recycling. They're pushing hard on it. I'm not sure they aren't pushing maybe a little too hard, frankly, in the sense of where I think the economics are going to shake out. Aluminum's a real winner, as all of you know. About 60% of all aluminum cans are already recycled. It's pretty cost-effective to recycle aluminum. You save a lot of energy. Takes much less energy to make an aluminum can out of an old aluminum can than it does to start with the raw materials. Now, that's the good news. The bad news on aluminum is twofold. One is there's not much aluminum in the waste stream. There's only about 2% of our garbage, in fact, is aluminum. And of that 2%, only about 1% is aluminum cans. The rest are lawn furniture and window sashings and all kinds of other aluminum, which are much harder to recycle. Steel cans or tin cans, about 15-20% recycled already. Of course, we recycle a huge amount of steel in the form of car bodies, old locomotives, things of that nature. About half of the feedstock to the steel mills in this country, in fact, is scrap steel. So that's a huge business. I don't typically think of that the same way, though, because we don't typically put our car bodies in the garbage can. It's really an off-to-the-side other industry. So the thing I'm really focusing on are food cans, number 10 food cans, other kinds of things like that, which we'll recycle more in the future. One of the real sleepers in solid waste, and it doesn't affect you too much probably, but about 20% of our garbage is yard waste. Yard clippings, tree branches, leaves, things that people rake up in the yards or city parks. Fairly easy to compost and deal with that. But that's going to be a very big deal as people try to keep that fairly low value stuff from filling up our landfills. About 20%, as I say, of all of that material is yard waste. Now you get into food waste. Food waste in this country is about 7 or 8 or 9%. Of the solid waste in this country, about 8% is food waste. And one little line you may want to use some places, we have this big sort of image among some of the environmental groups and others, is this sort of terrible throwaway society. I'm not sure we're all that terrible. I've lived in the Middle East in a lot of places, and in those kind of countries where they don't have good packaging, about half their waste is food waste. About half of their garbage in a place like Cairo, in fact, is food waste because the food tends to spoil. They don't have good packaging. They don't have very good refrigeration. So one of the reasons we have such a very small amount of food waste in this country is, in fact, we have good refrigeration and perhaps more importantly, we have good packaging. Because one of the debates you'll hear a lot right now is a lot about we're a throwaway society. We've got to stop throwing things away. And number two, we're an over-packaging society. We over-package things. And I guess I'm not here trying to fight your battles for you or anybody else's battles, but I'm not sure that's really totally true. I think that we have good packaging. I think we need to look at it, but I'm not sure that we do a lot of over-packaging. Now let me talk about where I think we're heading on some of these subjects on the national level. I've talked a little bit about some of the methods we can use to deal with these issues. I've talked some about waste-to-energy plants, that is incinerators, and there's about 100 of these around the country. A lot of people act like this is something sort of new and novel, but in fact there's quite a few waste-to-energy plants. Florida has a number of them being planned right now. There's a number being planned around the country. They typically generate about 50 or 60 megawatts of power. So I think it's not a bad way to generate some power as well as to deal with an issue. There's new regulations coming out both the state and federal level on landfills. I'm much more optimistic about landfills than I was in the past because we've now, I think, learned how to do very good landfills, and new modern landfills are going to be much better. One of the things that's happening with all this stuff is it's getting much more expensive. When I talk about new modern landfills, I'm also talking about costs 3 or 4 times what they were in the recent past. Just to take an extreme example, in New Jersey, garbage cost about $10 a ton to get rid of as far as the tipping fee at the landfill 10 years ago. It's over $100 a ton now. So it's gone up a factor of 10 in 10 years. And that's if you can find a place to put it, because New York and New Jersey export a lot of their garbage to Ohio and places like that, and that's another tough issue coming on down the pike. No one likes to receive someone else's garbage, but we're seeing a lot of that around the country. At this time in history, we recycle about 13% of the solid waste in the country. We burn or incinerate about 14%, and the 77 or whatever is left, 73% is landfilling. I think we're heading toward about 25% recycling, as I've said, and from there. Now, I want to switch gears and talk to you about some federal legislation that's coming down. Right now, the Congress is considering the reauthorization of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, better known as RCRA, RCRA. RCRA is the basic solid and hazardous waste law for the country. Congress is reauthorizing this law as we speak. Senator Baucus is the key guy on the Senate side from Montana, Al Swift, Congressman Swift on the House side from Washington State, and their two committees are having hearings and are dealing with these issues. And I want to give you a little bit of a heads up in terms of what they're talking about, because while I don't think a lot of this will pass, or it may not pass in this form, it's very important to know what Congress is thinking. Sometimes it scares you to know what Congress is thinking, but I think it's important to talk about what Congress is thinking because this will ripple into the states and other things. First off, the law sets a priority in the country, sort of like this. It says the first priority is to reduce solid waste at the source. The second priority is recycling. The third priority is treatment of the waste, and the fourth is incineration and containment. So they're trying to kind of ripple through everything we do in terms of sort of a hierarchy. Let me digress to talk a little bit about source reduction. You'll hear that term a lot these days. We've got to reduce garbage at the source. And a lot of what they talk about in this law is how can we reduce garbage at the source. And they do things like setting up a products and packaging board. They would set up under this legislation, if it passed, a national products and packaging board. This would be administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it would actually try to tell the country, in effect, what's good packaging and what's bad packaging, what's a good product and what's a bad product from an environmental standpoint. I'm not wild about that. I'll be real frank with you. I think, first off, I think you've got to look at packaging in the total context of the function of the packaging as well as its environmental impacts. When you think about syringes and things like that in hospitals, they have a very important use that has to be thought through carefully in addition to their solid waste problem. And you can, in a more mundane level, the same thing is true of putting a hamburger in some kind of a container. You also would like to keep the hamburger warm, you'd like to keep it sanitary, and then you'd also like to deal with the solid waste issue. So I think if they do that, one of the things I don't like about it so far is I wouldn't put it in EPA. EPA has a strong role, obviously, in the environmental side of things, but I'm not sure they're the experts on packaging per se. But anyway, Congress is talking about that, about how can we reduce waste by being more efficient in our packaging. And I think that's an area where folks like you and your suppliers and others have really got to feed into these state legislatures and into Congress in terms of what the issues are in packaging. Because right now, they're really coming at it, in my judgment, kind of a single purpose. How can we reduce solid waste, period? And that's an important discussion, but it's not the only reason we have packaging. The other thing that the law does, it would set a 10% reduction goal by the year 2000. It would say we need to reduce our solid waste in this country, irrespective of population growth, by about 10% by the year 2000, and would presumably deal with that. I might just say one more thing on packaging, and I don't mean to beat this to death, but it's a favorite subject of mine because I think it's a kind of thing we spend a lot of time on the national level for probably not very much result. Give you an example of that. The Council of Northeast Governors up in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, that area, has been meeting for over a year with some environmental groups, some business representatives, and governor's staff to try to draft some legislation for those 7 or 8 states that would deal with how can we reduce garbage at the source. And they've just gotten nowhere, frankly. And their people are coming at it from a good faith standpoint, but from the people who have to make the packaging, to the people who have to write the laws, to the environmental folks who want 50% reduction overnight, for example, it's just a very contentious situation of how would you specify at the national level or even the state level what's a good package and a bad package. Obviously, you need safety and you need other issues, but I don't mean to trivialize that whole effort, but I am worried that we're going to dissipate a lot of energy trying to deal with packaging, and I'm not sure it's going to really save us very much. The law would also set a 25% recycling goal for the country by 1995. We have to recycle all our garbage 25% by 95 and 50% by the year 2000. Let me just, if you don't mind my editorial comments here a little bit, this is not an academic speech. I'm injecting some of my own thoughts, as you noticed. The 50% is a very high goal for recycling. I talked earlier about saying the 25% because I thought it was in the right ballpark. It doesn't mean Montana and Wyoming and California and Texas are all going to have to be in the same area, or New York City and Baytown, where I grew up, have to be the same area. But it's not a bad number. 50%, on the other hand, which California has set a 50% goal, New York has set a 50% goal, the Congress is talking about a 50% recycling goal. My judgment is that's going to be, if not impossible, close to it, and certainly fairly impossible in any kind of a reasonable economics. It's just going to cost one heck of a lot of money. What we're doing now, we're recycling the sort of easy stuff, and we're getting into the harder stuff. We're recycling a lot of newspapers, a lot of corrugated, a fair amount of containers that are fairly easy to recognize. But once you get into the bicycle pumps and the toaster ovens and the other things, the mixed plastics, it gets a lot more expensive. And I guess you can do anything for money, certainly, but I guess my question is, and the mayors are asking the same question around the country, is this the best place to spend this money? You've got a school funding problem here in Texas. There's lots of other issues. So what I'm a little worried about is that and maybe I helped start some of this, Firar, recycling is a good thing to do, but there's a limit to everything. And I'm afraid what's happened is the politicians have picked up so much on recycling, they can't, I used to say that no matter what number I can think of, you guys can think of a better number or a higher number. And so they took my old 25% and said, well, 25% is good, 50% must be twice as good. So you're seeing kind of a bidding match around the country, who can do the most recycling, or maybe more accurately, who can promise the most recycling. And I'm a little worried about that because I'm not sure it's critical to get to those kind of numbers when I look at the amount of money. Because frankly, recycling is coming in in a pretty expensive fashion. It's going to get better as our markets develop and all that. But just as one data point, these waste-to-energy plants I talked about that are being planned around the country, they're typically running about $50 or $60 a ton. You can get a 20-year levelized cost for a waste-to-energy plant, about $50 to $60 a ton to burn your garbage and make power. Most of the recycling programs are in the hundreds of dollars per ton, $100 or $200 or $300 or $400 per ton. So again, I think that'll come down somewhat, but right now at least it's quite a bit more expensive than the alternatives. One other thing the law would do that Congress is talking about, it would set individual goals for individual commodities. In addition to this 25% recycling goal and the 50% by the year 2000, it would set specific goals for individual commodities. It would say, for example, that we have to recycle 52%, I'm not sure where they get these precise numbers, 52% of all our newsprint. They have that goal there. 66% of all corrugated, which would certainly impact you. 66% of all corrugated in the country, up from about 45 or 50%. And then on and on and on. And that's 25% for plastic bottles. And one of the things they're good at Congress these days now is they have what's called hammers. And these hammers are meant to sort of coerce the EPA and other people into doing things. And so if you don't do something, the law sort of hits you somewhere else. And one of the clever things they've done on plastics, for example, in this law, is they've said if you don't recycle 25% of all plastic bottles and containers by 95, then by the year 2000, all plastic has to have a 40% recycled content. These are somewhat apples and oranges, but that has never stopped them before. So that's going to be interesting. And there's a bunch of other things that are in this law. I won't go through the rest of it. The last point I might mention that's going to be very, very contentious, and I've just written an article about this that you may see some places. The most contentious thing in the solid waste debate nationally, and I don't think it'll affect you too much, but it'll affect you some, is interstate movement of garbage. The people in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois are just really not at all amused about this New York and New Jersey garbage coming their way. And they've tried everything. They've tried passing executive orders by governors and redefining garbage and writing new health standards and sending out the National Guard and almost everything. But frankly, the courts just keep pointing out that you can't do that in this country. There's something in the Constitution called the Commerce Clause, which doesn't let anybody but the federal government deal with interstate commerce. So the state of Ohio cannot set up a law, apparently, that says the state of Ohio will not receive New York garbage, or the state of Texas will not receive Louisiana garbage. Now, that's what the courts have said to this date. What Congress is doing, and Congress can legislate. Congress, as I say, I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand this legal situation, Congress can legislate, and they can set this kind of policy. Of course, it's very difficult because in the Congress you have people there from New York as well as Ohio, so they neutralize each other to some extent. But what they come up with is a situation where they would allow a receiving state to charge up to 4 times as much for handling the garbage from a contiguous state as their own garbage, and would allow them to charge up to 10 times as much for a non-contiguous state, read New York, New Jersey. In other words, if you're in Ohio and New York and New Jersey garbage comes to Ohio or Indiana, then you can charge up to 10 times the amount that you would charge for your own state. Again, I don't think that's going to happen anytime real soon, but that's going to be a big debate, and you'll certainly see some of it here. I got in some terrible debates in Congress when I was there, or dealing with Congress, about Texas versus other states, mainly on the hazardous waste issue. The Alabama folks were very put upon because they thought they were receiving an inordinate amount of Texas hazardous waste over in Alabama. I had to point out to them that instant they were sending 3 times as much stuff to Texas as Texas was sending to them. That wasn't popular at all when I said that. But you know, we have an interstate movement in this stuff, and it's more in hazardous waste than it is in garbage. But we do have a fair amount of movement between states, and I'm not sure it's all bad or it's worse to send garbage, say 10 miles across a state border, that's somehow worse than say sending it 500 miles within the same state. I think from an environmental and an energy standpoint, going to a regional facility, if people can work it out, the state boundaries don't necessarily have to be critical. Let me switch gears and talk just a minute. I want to leave time for questions here, but let me switch gears and talk just a minute about Texas. I've had a chance to read a new Texas law on recycling, which just came out in May, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's fairly dramatic, actually. I didn't see it get a whole lot of publicity, but it's a very dramatic law on recycling that the Texas legislature has just passed. I've mentioned a lot of these numbers in terms of what the goals are and so forth. The Texas law would have the state of Texas recycle 40% of all of its municipal solid waste by January 1, 1994. That's only 2.5 years from now. So I think that's about the most dramatic goal in the nation. I don't know if they realize that or not, but the states like New York and California that have 50% goals, those tend to be for the year 2000. So they're kind of out there beyond someone's term of office and that kind of thing. But the Texas goal is right on top of us. And one of the issues that Texas law brings up, and it's a big issue around the country, is how do you define recycling? You know, it sounds simple. We all talk about these numbers. Well, the Texas folks were fairly clever, actually, in the sense they set the goal of 40% in only 2.5 years. But I don't know if they realize it or not in terms of being clever, but they didn't really define how to calculate it. So I think the good news is they can probably be fairly creative now in how they calculate the 40%. And what I mean by that is different states are doing it differently. For example, in Florida, if you recycle yard waste, you can only count half of that. In some states, in fact, the federal legislation, you can't count yard waste at all in your equation. In California, you can count up to 10% waste to energy as part of your recycling goal. In New Jersey, Governor Florio up there has been very creative. He basically doubled his recycling rate in 1 year by just changing the definition. New Jersey was at about 19% recycling, and they're now allegedly at 39% recycling in 1 year, because what they did is they decided that things like asphalt and demolition waste should all be counted as garbage. So they've just thrown in a lot of things that we wouldn't typically think of as garbage and said, look at all this wonderful recycling we're doing, because we recover asphalt and things like that. So that's going to be very important, is and that'll hit you folks too in terms of how do you define garbage. When people start talking to you, the way I define garbage is fairly simple, or solid waste. It's what you typically put in a dumpster or a garbage can. I mean, that's not a perfectly elegant definition, and it typically includes the containers and the cans and the paper and the food waste and whatever we think of. It doesn't include used tires. It doesn't include demolition waste. It doesn't include tree stumps. It doesn't include used asphalt. I mean, those are good things to deal with, and I think we could have another list for those. But I think if you start mixing and matching those very high volume, it doesn't include car bodies. One thing Jim Florio has done is he's counting car bodies. You know, well, that's been happening all along. Most of the used cars in this country, the old cars, are scrapped and made back into steel. They don't go in your garbage can, though. So I think we're getting a little far afield with some of those definitions. And that's going to be very important in Texas with your new 40% and 2.5 year goal as they try to implement this. And you'll want to watch those regulations very carefully. I don't remember the exact date, but I think in about 6 months the state has to have out regulations, which are the important thing in these kind of things, because they'll tell you how you and other folks are going to have to get to this 40% goal. Let me close by giving you a few observations about your business and about where I think things are going. First off, I think solid waste is just going to get more and more intense as a problem in this country. In this part of the world, you still have quite a bit of room for landfills, and many of the landfills in Texas have quite a bit of room. On the other hand, the new regulations for landfills are going to make it much more expensive to landfill in Texas, and will rule out some areas as spots for landfills. We have much tougher requirements. It's going to be more intense, probably more controversial in the short term. Any of you have been to a public hearing lately on a new landfill or a congressional hearing on some of these things know that there's nothing people are more excited about than garbage, particularly if it's coming anywhere near their backyard. So I think you're going to see this as a very contentious sort of thing. I don't see any easy fixes. I don't see anything that will sort of get us off the hook real easily. A lot of people have this kind of vision. Some of my environmental friends, the vision is like we'll recycle everything, and what we can't recycle, we'll compost, because these are both very benign, good things to do. Well, let me just talk about composting 1 second. I want to just hit that in closing. Composting, which is very relevant for food waste, or can be very relevant for food waste, and maybe something you'll get pushed to do, I think is an interesting technology. It's not by any means, though, a panacea. We only have about 10 places in the country, most of them very small towns, where we're trying to compost so-called mixed waste, that is municipal solid waste. There's about 1,400 places where we're composting leaves and yard waste and that kind of stuff. But where we've tried to compost food waste and regular garbage, it's usually been pretty difficult. Rodent problems, odor problems, air pollution problems. Dade County, Florida is in the process now of having a lot of flack over a big facility they built. The city or the folks that run the county want to shut it down and so forth. That's the only big one in the country. So when people talk to you about running out and composting everything, particularly food waste, we have a ways to go there in my judgment. I'm not ruling it out, but it's not a panacea, and it's pretty expensive. It's pretty expensive to do that, because you've got to aerate the stuff, and you've got to turn it, and you've got to be sure you don't have a lot of other problems. So I think increased recycling will help. I think more importantly is to look at all our options, to look at them as frankly as we can in the sense of how do you integrate these things. One of the things about integrating these things is that you do things that work well together. I mean, as I said earlier, why would you, if you can avoid it, there's no point in putting glass in an incinerator, it's not going to burn. So if you can avoid it, you might want to recycle it. There's no point in putting aluminum cans in an incinerator. They're not going to burn, plus they have pretty good value. On the other hand, most of your paper products contaminated by food, I think are an excellent candidate for either a landfill or an incinerator. I think it's going to be quite a long distance away before reclaiming much paper that's contaminated with food. I think the technology for doing that and the cost of doing that are very great, and I just don't see any problem, frankly, with either handling those, possibly in composting someday, but probably in the nearer term in landfilling or incineration. I think that you'll be part of the focal point on these issues. I think the food industry, certainly McDonald's, where I've been working a lot, has been a terrific focal point for all the sins of the world on solid waste, as people try to deal with this sort of perception of a throwaway society, and the perception of food waste, and the perception of plastic, and a lot of other things. I guess what I would ask you to do, or have you think about doing on these issues, is number one, keep informed, because it is going to impact you. Just hearing my McDonald's friends talk, they talk about stories around the country from $40 a month to handle a garbage in a typical store to a couple of $1,000s a month, per month to handle the garbage from stores. So the prices are really going up, as you know, and they're going to go up here in Texas too. I think I would learn as much as I can about recycling. It's not a panacea, but there are some things you can do. Corrugated, for example, is something which is going to be a real winner, I think. A lot of corrugated is already recycled. If you can get your cardboard boxes behind the counter, so to speak, and deal with that, that's going to make a lot of sense. And then I think you're going to need to be very active with the state, particularly, in dealing with these issues as they write regulations. Because the folks that write these regulations don't always know a lot about your business or any other business, frankly, and you've really got to be sure they understand your special concerns. So let me close with that. I have some other things I could say, but I think rather than talking a whole lot longer, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and see what's on your mind so I can maybe reflect a little of that. Does anybody have any questions on solid waste, or have you got it totally under control? Yes, sir.
What do you think the law that is going to be a full packaging procedure? How do we come up looking for it, the environmental, is it going to phase that out?
The question had to do with foam packaging, and it's really amazing to me that this one innocent little element could attract so much attention. But you know, we deal in this country in symbols, and I would say more than the foam packaging, the clamshell hamburger holder got to be the visible symbol of solid waste in this country. And McDonald's changed, frankly, from that. They didn't change, or they haven't changed yet, in terms of taking off a lot of the other polystyrene. They still use a lot of polystyrene in a McDonald's store. The utensils, The tops for the coffee itself is still in a foam cup. I'm not sure what's going to happen on that, but what they did is they went to a smaller wrap, a paper wrap. I guess my feeling is, first off, I'd say this. I think that from an environmental standpoint, if you look fairly objectively, I'm a chemical engineer. I know how to make these calculations, and I've done them, and I've worked with people who have done them. And you lay a paper cup, for example, and a foam cup side by side, and you run through all the calculations, from the cutting down the trees to bringing in the oil to the transportation to the whatever. The foam cup comes out pretty well. I won't say it's always better than every conceivable kind of paper, because that'd probably be overstating it. But certainly from an overall environmental standpoint, I think plastics in general and foam in particular come out very well. And I think that's been lost in the shuffle here, that there really is no great environmental problem. There's a terrific perception problem. I guess if I had to prognosticate a little bit, when you look around the country, a lot of people are still using foam, and it's a pretty popular product. It serves up things in a warm, sort of sanitary way. I think it's going to be around a while. I mean, I think that some of that furor is dying down in the sense of the foam cups. I think it probably, on the other hand, makes sense to recycle foam cups. I think they're one thing that, because they nest well and there's a fair market for those, or will be, that it probably makes some sense to recycle foam cups. But I think that maybe the worst is over on the foam situation. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you were sending garbage to Hawaii.
I don't think so. No, that would be a real bummer. No, there's a diagram I saw recently that shows how garbage moves around the country, had a bunch of arrows showing from states to state, and there's a lot of movement of garbage between states. Most of it's fairly short distance. The only really long distance is from the northeast into the south, to some extent South Carolina and Alabama, and then much more from kind of due west, where folks are shipping from Newark, New Jersey, particularly to the states I mentioned. But garbage doesn't move too far. I mean, it's pretty heavy stuff to move around. It costs a lot of money to ship garbage very far, so you don't see too much of that. Yes, ma'am. McDonald's is going to a new wrap, and the way they, and I think there is some good aspect, is what they've kind of done to some extent is they've traded off to some extent recycling or recyclability for volume. That they're saying this new wrap that they wrap their hamburgers in, or some of their hamburgers, is much smaller and lighter and has less weight and volume than the equivalent plastic container. And so, but that's, I don't know how that's going to shake out long term. You're right, the thing they replaced it with is not terribly recyclable, because it's a multi-material sort of thing. It's very small, and I think their attitude is that, it won't take up much room in landfills. It'll burn in waste energy plants if you do that. But at least in the near term, it's not. I mean, that's one of the frankly big advantages over foam to paper with respect to food, is that the foam doesn't pick up the taste and odor and the contamination that paper does. I mean, no one, I don't think, wants to recycle a paper napkin that's got ketchup on it. That's just worth nothing in the used paper market. Whereas I think eventually on the plastic side, because it doesn't pick up as much taste and odor and it can be dealt with, although even there I must say that, just to give you one little anecdote, Procter & Gamble is recycling milk, they're recycling milk jugs into their bottles that they hold detergent with. And they've had some problem with odor from those milk jugs in their detergent bottles, and they've had to do some special things in terms of processing. So it's not a free ride. But I think that is one of the advantages of plastic. It doesn't pick up that odor. Yes, sir.
One of the problems in some areas appears to be, and I think the problem in the Corpus Christi area where I'm from, is a lack of agency to handle recyclable materials. For example, foam cups. I don't know if we're anywhere close where we can dispose of those recyclable materials. So, take them and recycle them.
The question had to do with I guess, markets and who will pick them up and where do you send these things once you've collected them. That's a very good question, and that's one reason why I've been struggling when I talk to people in the agencies and so forth, is say, we need some time here because to use an overworked word now, the infrastructure is just not there. It's certainly there for aluminum. There's 10,000 collection points in this country for aluminum because Alcoa and Reynolds have put them there. There's 2 or 3 companies that do most of the aluminum cans in this country, and they frankly make money recycling, so they've had all the incentive in the world to really get out there and set up these places. Corrugated's pretty well developed. But once you get beyond 2 or 3 of these things, I mean, newsprint is kind of a glut on the market now. The paper companies are building new de-inking facilities and other things to handle this sort of free feedstock they're going to be getting. But most of the things are getting kind of behind the curve. And plastic is one where, frankly, the large companies are spending a lot of money, the DuPonts and the Dows and others, trying to get this infrastructure set up. But it's not there yet. And I think that's one of the things you need to point out to your state legislatures and others is that, look, we're happy to recycle as long as it makes some kind of sense and as long as we can get our customers to do it. I might just digress 1 second here if I can. I don't want to talk too much about McDonald's, but they had a real problem getting customers to do the right thing. When I say that, I mean a very high percent. When they put these containers out there and said, put all your foam products in this side and put all your paper in this side, they had some problems. People go in there, they're in a hurry or whatever, and so they had a lot of Big Macs in their plastic containers. So I'm just digressing a little bit, but there is a semi-voluntary component of some of this. When you start getting the public to say, would you all mind doing this and this and this? Well, remember, some people throw their beer cans beside the road. And those same people come into your stores, I guess, and or your restaurants, and so trying to get people to do that right is going to take some time and some education, and then probably more importantly is developing the markets. Because frankly, what we've got in the country now in some locations is we have people call it recycling, but we really have a collection program. There's even a few horror stories where people are collecting stuff, keeping it for a while, and then sheepishly putting it back in the landfill because they haven't been able to get rid of it. So, I mean, I think that these markets are going to develop, but there's no point in kidding ourselves, in my judgment. They're not going to develop to the extent of 50 or 70% recycling anytime soon. Yes, sir, way back here. The question had to do with food waste and fats and oils and greases and new technologies coming along. Yeah, I see some things. I don't, certainly on the handling the waste per se, one of the things I mentioned earlier is composting, that some people say, why don't we just take all of our organic waste and compost them along with other things. And I think, as I said, that may have some relevance in some places, although it's certainly not a panacea. I think that I'm seeing some new techniques come along on some of those areas. I think we've got a long ways to go. And again, I think that's where you've got to be sure the legislators don't give you a situation where you suddenly got to do things. For example, the Clean Water Act talks a lot, or the new Clean Water Act talks a lot about what you can put in the sewer and you can't put in the sewer. So you'll have to watch that because that's another law that is churning along, and you may find out that things you've been able to put in the sewer or some other way in the past may be prescribed against in the future. I don't see a lot of real breakthroughs. Now, maybe somebody in the room can correct me, but anybody else got it? Yes, sir.
One of the problems that some of the legislation has brought about that you might want to address is requirements that land be tested when its use is going to be changed. There's been some horror stories of people who have bought property and discovered that they hadn't spent many thousands of dollars cleaning it up, and that their only option is to sell it in that condition.
Yeah. Question had to do with buying and selling property and not getting in a situation where you discover there's something buried there or on the site or whatever. Absolutely. When I ran the Superfund program, that was one of the most difficult things in Superfund was a so-called innocent landowner provision, which Congress put in, which turned out to be not so innocent. And when people buy and sell property in this country now, you've got to be very careful that because you may acquire something, for example, that you didn't put there. And if you get captured by the Superfund program, that's a real bummer, frankly, because you're really in for it for big bucks if you become a Superfund site. The other one that probably doesn't affect you quite as much, but it might, that you really need to watch out for is if you acquire anything that looked like an old service station property, because the underground storage tank program in this country is pretty dramatic. There's very stringent laws now on what you've got to do if you have a chemical or gasoline tank buried in the ground. And we've had a lot of people who've come to me and said, gee, I bought this old service station property over here and I was going to put a restaurant on it or do something with it, and I discover, because sometimes they don't even dig up those tanks. You know, the majors do, but there's a lot of people that have had sort of mom and pop gas stations or other kinds of stations, and they're tied to convenience stores and whatever, and sometimes those people have not even dug up the tanks. You find out 5 years later that there's a gasoline tank, and in some cases, and this is very rare fortunately, they didn't remove the gasoline, or at least didn't remove all of it. And if you have 10,000 gallons of gasoline sitting there, and that's rare because 10,000 gallons of gasoline is worth something, but there are cases where people didn't drain it totally. Maybe they left in 500 gallons or 100 gallons. Well, 100 gallons of gasoline goes a long ways if it gets into the groundwater. It only takes about a gallon of gasoline to contaminate 1 million gallons of water. So if you get this gasoline kind of spreading out through an old tank. So I guess my advice to you on that wasn't necessarily the subject of my talk, but it's a good point, is if you are buying and selling property, you want to be real careful in terms of looking at what went on there. You may have to have some kind of an environmental assessment done if it's anything real major, just to be sure you're not acquiring some problem that somebody else had. Maybe they buried all their grease there, or maybe they had their own little landfill or something. You want to be real careful in something like that. Anybody else got anything, or is it? Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to wish you good luck in your endeavors. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Porter, thank you very much. There will be 2 other conferences in
to do. They have to make good plays all game long. The Brazilians made the good plays last game. Now the Americans have to.
And what was good about that play was a trouble play. Cody got knocked down again, but she just shot it deep into the wind.
Fontana's got it. And that's a point. That is the Fontana-Codis game right there.
The defense is very important. Fontana is so good at defense. She has got to make those plays all game long if they're going to stay in it.
Before she went to law school at Santa Clara, did her undergrad work at Stanford, where she was an outstanding player. And she misses that serve, but nevertheless, they have a 2-0 lead.
And when she was at Stanford, Lynn, she's only 5'6", but she was such a tremendous all-around player. She was a starter and played an outside hitter and had a great career at Stanford.
Tim can run it down, and they keep it in play. Oh, another great play by Rosalie Tim, and that's a point, 2-1.
Well, if you had to pick the quickest player in this tournament, it's got to be Rosalie Tim. Look at how fast she gets up. She has time to almost look at the defense. She is very quick. I'd say she's quicker than Fontana.
She's showing that she's quicker right now, and there's an ace serve by Salgado. That's a very tough serve from the bad side hitting the back line. There's really nothing you can do about that.
So at 2-2, they're going to get, at the worst, a 3-2 side change, and they'll be happy about that. It's dug by Tim. A back set by Codis, kind of, and Fontana misses it. So the Brazilians, with an impressive 3-2 on the first side change, they now lead.
You know, when Lori Codis and Barbara Fontana played in Brazil in November, they stayed an extra 3 weeks, and they played against this team every day. Maybe they're probably saying to themselves, maybe we helped them out a little too much.
Blocked by Codis, but Tim has got it. Tim is there again. And finds the open sand, which is all important.
Well, it just looks like Tim, not only is she quick, but she can read. If you have both of those attributes, it makes you a tremendous defensive player. But show how important reactions are. She hits this ball straight down, but she covers herself. Her own coverage, that is a very difficult play to make.
There it is, the deep shot into the court. Codis seems to like that shot, and it's very difficult for the Brazilians to pick up. That's been very successful for her.
And the serve for Barbara Fontana.
Down 4-2, Barbara Fontana will serve. Wow, Salgado, she's quick on that, hitting in 2.
Well, I think that Barbara Fontana is quite surprised they're passing her jump serve, even on both sides, because she's so used to getting really easy points that they're a little confused because the rhythm of Brazil is a little bit faster.
The jump serve on the bad side does not move as much, so it's not as difficult to pass.